Captain Lee Minji adjusted her white dress uniform one final time as she walked down the long corridor toward the ceremonial hall. The metal walls of UNS Harmony Station hummed softly around her, filled with the quiet energy that powered humanity's most important diplomatic outpost. Through the small windows, she could see Earth hanging like a blue marble in the darkness of space, reminding her of everything she was fighting to protect. Today was supposed to be the most important day in recent human history. The marriage between her and Commander Park Do-hyun would symbolize the unity that humanity desperately needed after the terrible Proxima War had ended just 2 years ago. That war had cost millions of lives and left the human colonies scattered and broken. The military leaders believed that a public wedding between two decorated officers would show the galaxy that humans could come together as one people again. Minji had never wanted to get married like this, in front of cameras and politicians, but she understood her duty. She had volunteered for dangerous missions before, and this felt like just another assignment. Commander Park seemed like a decent man from their brief meetings, though she barely knew him. They had been chosen not for love, but because they represented different branches of the military that needed to work together. The ceremonial hall was massive, with seats for over 3,000 guests. Representatives from every human colony had traveled here, along with ambassadors from alien species who wanted to observe this historic moment. The room buzzed with conversation in dozens of languages. Giant screens showed the ceremony to billions of viewers across human space. Minji entered the hall and felt the weight of every eye upon her. She walked slowly down the aisle, her boots clicking against the polished floor. The altar had been decorated with symbols from old Korea, including traditional lanterns and flowers that had been carefully grown in the station's gardens. Her grandmother would have been proud to see the old customs honored even in space. Commander Park Do-hyun stood waiting at the altar in his crisp blue uniform. He was tall and handsome, with the confident bearing of someone who had commanded troops in battle. When their eyes met, he smiled, but something in his expression made Minji feel uneasy. She pushed the feeling aside and continued walking. The ceremony began with ancient words spoken in Korean, then translated for the crowd. They exchanged traditional vows about honor, duty, and service to humanity. Everything proceeded according to the careful script that had been planned for months. The cameras captured every moment, broadcasting their words across the solar system. Then came the moment for the ceremonial cake cutting, a tradition that combined old Korean customs with the practical realities of space life. The cake had been specially prepared by the station's best chefs, decorated with symbols representing the unity of human colonies. It sat on a small table between them, beautiful and perfect. Minji reached for the ceremonial knife, expecting to cut the first slice with Do-hyun as they had practiced. But suddenly, without warning, Do-hyun stepped forward and grabbed the entire top layer of the cake with both hands. Before anyone could react, he lifted it high and smashed it directly into Minji's face. The hall fell completely silent. Cake and frosting dripped from Minji's hair and uniform. She stood frozen in shock, her mouth slightly open, unable to process what had just happened. The sweet taste of vanilla frosting mixed with the bitter taste of humiliation. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. 3,000 people stared in stunned disbelief. The cameras continued rolling, sending this moment of shame to every corner of human civilization. Children watching at home with their families, soldiers in distant outposts, politicians in their comfortable offices on Earth. Do-hyun stepped back with a satisfied smile on his face, as if he had accomplished exactly what he intended. His uniform remained spotless, while Minji stood covered in cake, looking like a fool in front of the entire human race. Some of the guests began to whisper. Others looked away in embarrassment. Minji felt hot tears starting to form in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had faced enemy fire in the Proxima War. She had seen friends die in space battles. She had commanded troops through impossible situations. But somehow this public humiliation felt worse than any of those experiences. She slowly wiped some of the cake from her eyes, trying to clear her vision. The ceremonial hall seemed to spin around her. Every face in the crowd looked shocked or pitying or amused. The alien ambassadors were probably taking notes about how weak humans were, how easily they could be degraded. But then something changed inside Minji. The shock began to fade, replaced by a cold anger that started in her stomach and spread through her entire body. Her grandmother had told her stories about surviving the old Korean War, about rebuilding from nothing, about never giving up no matter how hopeless things seemed. She looked at Do-hyun, who was still smiling as if this was all a joke. She looked at the crowd, waiting to see what she would do next. She looked at the cameras, knowing that her next action would be remembered forever. The taste of cake was still sweet on her lips, but now it tasted like something else entirely. It tasted like the beginning of something new. The frosting dripped, slowly from Minji's face, onto the polished floor of the ceremonial hall. For a moment that seemed to last forever, she stood perfectly still, feeling the weight of 3,000 pairs of eyes, watching her every move. The sweet smell of vanilla cake filled her nostrils, mixing with the metallic taste of anger in her mouth. Slowly, deliberately, Minji raised her hand and wiped the thick frosting from her eyes. Her vision cleared, and she could see Do-hyun standing, there with that smug smile still on his face. He looked proud of himself, as if embarrassing her in front of the entire human race was some kind of achievement. Behind him, she could see the shocked faces of diplomats and military officers who had come to witness what was supposed to be a moment of unity. But instead of the tears that everyone expected, instead of running away in shame, Minji began to smile. It was not a happy smile or a friendly smile. It was the cold, dangerous smile of a combat veteran who had decided that the time for being polite was over. She turned away from Do-hyun and walked calmly to the ceremonial table where the bottle of wine sat waiting. It was a special bottle over 200 years old, brought from Earth's finest vineyard specifically for this occasion. The bottle was worth more than most people earned in a year, and it was supposed to be shared between the bride and groom as a symbol of their new life together. Minji picked up the heavy bottle and held it high above her head. The hall remained, silent except for the soft hum of the station's life support systems. Even the whispers had stopped, as everyone waited to see what she would do next. Without hesitation, Minji poured the expensive wine over her own head. The dark red liquid flowed through her hair and down her face, mixing with the white frosting and staining her pristine uniform. The wine was cold against her skin, and she could smell its rich, complex aroma as it soaked into her clothes. "My grandmother told me stories," Minji said, her voice clear and strong enough to carry throughout the silent hall. The station's communication system picked up her words and broadcast them to every corner of human space. "She told me about the old Korean War, when our people lost everything but never lost their dignity." She continued pouring the wine, letting it wash away the cake from her face and uniform. "She told me about the ancient purification ritual, where warriors would cleanse themselves after battle to wash away the dishonor of their enemies." The bottle was empty now, but Minji held it for a moment longer before setting it down gently. On the table, wine and frosting dripped from her hair onto the floor, creating a small puddle around her feet. Her once perfect uniform was ruined, but somehow she looked more powerful than ever. "In the name of my ancestors who survived when everyone said they could not survive," she declared, her voice growing stronger with each word. "In the name of those who rebuilt from ashes when others said it was impossible. In the name of every human who refused to bow down to those who would break their spirit." She paused, looking directly at Do-hyun, who was no longer smiling. His face had gone pale as he began to realize that this was not going according to his plan. "I wash away this dishonor," Minji continued, her voice now carrying a note of steel that made even the alien ambassadors sit up straighter in their seats. "Not mine, but yours." Then she turned to the table where the rest of the wedding cake sat waiting. The bottom tier was larger and heavier than the piece Do-hyun had thrown at her. It was decorated with intricate designs that represented the unity of human colonies. Crafted by artists who had worked for weeks to make it perfect, Minji lifted the entire cake with both hands. It was heavy, probably weighing 15 pounds, but her military training had made her strong. She held it like a weapon, testing its weight and balance with the instinct of someone who had thrown grenades in combat. The crowd began to murmur as they realized what she was about to do. Some of the diplomats started to stand up, as if they might try to stop her. But the military officers remained seated, watching with growing respect as their fellow soldier prepared to fight back. Do-hyun finally understood what was happening. He raised his hands and started to say something, but it was too late. Minji drew back her arms and launched the cake with all her strength, aiming for the center of his chest with the precision of someone who had been trained to hit targets under pressure. The cake flew through the air in a perfect arc. It struck Do-hyun squarely in the chest with a wet splat that echoed throughout the hall. The impact was so strong that he staggered backward, his arms windmilling as he tried to keep his balance. Cake exploded across his uniform, covering him, from neck to waist in frosting and crumbs. For a moment the hall remained silent. Then someone in the back began to clap slowly. Another person joined in, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted in applause and cheers that shook the station's metal walls. Minji stood there, covered in wine and cake, and smiled. The video spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Within the first hour after the ceremony ended, clips of Captain Lee Minji throwing the cake at Commander Park were being shared across every communication network in human space. People watched it on their personal devices, on public screens, in station corridors, and on the large displays in colony meeting halls. On Mars Station Beta, a mining facility that supplied raw materials to Earth, the workers gathered around their break room screen during the evening shift change. They had just finished 16 hours of dangerous work in the deep tunnels beneath the Martian surface, their faces still covered with red dust despite the cleaning stations. "Did you see that?" whispered Kim Jin-soo, a young tunnel supervisor who had been working on Mars for 3 years. She actually fought back. The other workers crowded closer to watch the video again. They had all heard about the wedding ceremony, but none of them had expected to see anything like this. Most of them had grown up in the outer colonies where people learned early to keep their heads down and not make trouble with those in authority. "Look at her face," said an older woman named Park Soo-min, who had been mining asteroids since before the Proxima War. She was not afraid at all. The video showed Minji's expression clearly as she lifted the cake and threw it with perfect aim. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation. Just cold determination and the kind of anger that comes from years of being told to accept things that should not be accepted. As the workers watched, their own supervisor, Manager Chen, walked into the break room. He was not Korean, but he had been put in charge of the Korean workers because the company thought all Asians were basically the same. For months, he had been making their lives miserable with impossible quotas, verbal abuse, and threats to send them back to Earth if they complained. "What are you all doing standing around?" Chen shouted. "Break time was over 5 minutes ago. Get back to work or I will dock your pay." Usually the workers would have scattered immediately. They needed their jobs, and jobs in space were not easy to find. But today something was different. They had just watched Captain Lee stand up to someone who tried to humiliate her, and her courage was infectious. Kim Jin-soo stepped forward, holding his tablet so Chen could see the video. "We were watching Captain Lee show us how to deal with bullies," he said quietly. Chen's face turned red with anger. "I do not care what some military princess did at her fancy party. You work for me, and when I say move, you move." The young supervisor looked around at his fellow workers. He saw the same expression on their faces that he had seen on Captain Lee's face in the video. They were tired of being pushed around. They were ready to push back. On Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, a similar scene was playing out at mining facility 7. The workers there spent their days extracting ice and rare minerals from beneath the moon's frozen surface. The work was dangerous, and the conditions were harsh, but what made it worse was Supervisor Yamamoto, who seemed to enjoy making the Korean workers feel worthless. The facility's cafeteria was full of workers watching the video on their personal devices when Yamamoto walked in carrying his dinner tray. He had been complaining all week about the quality of the synthetic protein paste that served as their main source of nutrition, but he still expected to eat in peace while the workers cleaned around him. "Turn off those screens and get back to our work," he ordered as he sat down at his table. "Some of us have important things to do." But the workers did not move. They continued watching the video, sharing it with others who had not seen it yet. The footage was grainy because it had been transmitted across millions of miles of space, but Captain Lee's message was crystal clear. Yamamoto stood up angrily and walked over to the nearest worker, a young woman named Lee Hyejin, who was showing the video to her friends. "I said turn it off," he shouted, reaching for her tablet. Hyejin pulled the device away from his grabbing hands. "We have the right to watch news during our break time," she said firmly. "You have the right to do what?" "I tell you to do," Yamamoto replied, his voice getting louder. "I am in charge here, not some cake-throwing princess on a space station." That was when Hyejin noticed the bowl of protein paste on Yamamoto's abandoned dinner tray. It was the same grey, tasteless substance that all the workers had to eat every day, the cheap nutrition that the company provided because it cost less than real food. She looked at the paste, then at Yamamoto's angry face, then back at her tablet, where Captain Lee was pouring wine over her head in an act of defiant purification. Without saying a word, Hyejin walked over to the supervisor's table, picked up his bowl of protein paste and dumped it over his head. The grey substance dripped down his face and onto his clean uniform, mixing with his hair and running down his neck. The cafeteria erupted in cheers and applause, just like the ceremonial hall on Harmony Station had done hours earlier. Within days, similar incidents were happening on space stations and colonies throughout human territory. Workers were standing up to abusive supervisors. Students were refusing to accept unfair treatment from teachers. Citizens were demanding better conditions from their local governments. The image of Captain Lee, covered in wine and cake but standing, proud and unbroken, began appearing on walls and screens everywhere. The military courtroom in Geneva was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls and in the corridors outside, all wanting to witness what had become the most important military trial in decades. The room buzzed with nervous energy as reporters from across human space set up their cameras and recording equipment. Captain Lee Minji sat at the defendant's table, wearing a clean dress uniform that had been specially prepared for the trial. Her lawyer, a young military attorney named Colonel Kim Seokjin, shuffled through papers beside her. Across the room, Commander Park Do-hyun sat with his own legal team, looking confident and relaxed as if he had already won. The three judges entered the courtroom, and everyone stood at attention. General Martinez, the chief judge, was a veteran of the Proxima War who had lost her left arm in the final battle. Judge Admiral Chen had commanded the defense of Earth's orbital stations during the worst part of the war. The third judge, General Okafor, had been responsible for evacuating civilians from the outer colonies when the fighting began. These were not politicians or bureaucrats. They were soldiers who understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than themselves. "This court-martial will now begin," General Martinez announced. "Commander Park Do-hyun has filed charges against Captain Lee Minji for conduct unbecoming an officer, assault on a superior officer, and disruption of a diplomatic ceremony." The prosecutor, a stern-faced major named Williams, stood up to present the case against Minji. He showed the video of the cake-throwing incident over and over again, pointing out how her actions had embarrassed the military and damaged human diplomatic relations. Captain Lee's behavior was completely unacceptable, Major Williams declared. She turned what should have been a moment of unity into a circus. Her actions have inspired violence and disorder throughout human space. Workers are attacking their supervisors. Students are rebelling against their teachers. This kind of behavior threatens the very foundation of military discipline. When it was Minji's turn to defend herself, she stood up slowly and walked to the center of the courtroom. She did not look nervous or afraid. Instead, she looked like a soldier preparing to fight the most important battle of her life. "Your Honors," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I am charged with conduct unbecoming an officer. But I ask you to consider what kind of conduct is truly unbecoming. Is it unbecoming to defend yourself when attacked? Is it unbecoming to stand up for your dignity when someone tries to destroy it in front of the entire human race?" She pulled out a thick folder of documents and placed it on the evidence table. "I have here proof that Commander Park was paid 50,000 credits by Stellar Corporation to humiliate me during the ceremony. They wanted to show that the military could be bought and controlled. They wanted to prove that human dignity was for sale. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Commander Park's face went pale as Minji continued speaking. The Code of Military Justice, Section 4.7, clearly states that any officer has the right to defend themselves against unprovoked assault, whether physical or psychological. When Commander Park threw that cake at me, he was not following tradition. He was following orders from corporate masters who wanted to see me broken and humiliated. Colonel Kim stood up and handed additional documents to the judges. Your Honors, we have bank records showing payments from Stellar Corporation to Commander Park's private account. We have recorded communications where corporate executives discuss their plan to embarrass Captain Lee and undermine the unity ceremony. General Martinez examined the documents carefully. Her expression grew darker as she read through the evidence. Judge Admiral Chen leaned over to look at the papers, his eyebrows rising in surprise. General Okafor shook his head in disgust. Furthermore, Minji continued, my actions were not just self-defense, they were a demonstration of the values that make humanity strong. When we are knocked down, we get back up. When we are humiliated, we refuse to accept it. When we are told to bow, we stand taller. She turned to face the packed courtroom, addressing not just the judges, but everyone who was watching. The prosecutor says that my actions have inspired violence and disorder. I say they have inspired courage and dignity. Workers who were being abused are finally standing up for themselves. Students who were being mistreated are demanding respect. Citizens who were being ignored are making their voices heard. This is not disorder. This is what happens when people remember that they deserve to be treated with dignity. The judges retired to their chambers to deliberate. For 6 long hours, the courtroom remained packed as people waited for the verdict. Outside, crowds gathered. In the streets of Geneva, and in public squares across human space. The trial had become more than just a military hearing. It had become a symbol of everything that humanity was fighting for. When the judges finally returned, the silence in the courtroom was complete. General Martinez stood up and looked directly at Minji. Captain Lee Minji, she said, this court finds you not guilty of all charges. Furthermore, in recognition of your courage, your leadership, and your unwavering commitment to human dignity, you are hereby promoted to the rank of Admiral, effective immediately. The courtroom exploded in cheers and applause that could be heard throughout the building. Minji stood at attention, tears streaming down her face as she became the youngest admiral in human military history. Outside, the crowds celebrated late into the night. Admiral Lee Minji stood on the bridge of the USNS Defiance, watching through the massive viewing window as a new world slowly rotated beneath them. The planet was beautiful, with blue oceans and green continents that reminded her of Earth. It was the 3rd habitable world her fleet had discovered in the past 2 years, and it would soon become home to thousands of human colonists looking for a fresh start among the stars. 5 years had passed since the incident at Harmony Station that had changed everything. Minji was now 32 years old and commanded the largest exploration fleet in human history. 12 ships followed her into the unknown regions of space, carrying scientists, engineers, and families, brave enough to build new lives on distant worlds. The Defiance was not just her flagship, but also a symbol of the new human spirit. The bow. Ship's hull was decorated with images from the Harmony incident, including the moment when Minji had poured wine over her head and thrown the cake. Children throughout human space grew up seeing those images and learning what they meant. That dignity was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Admiral, called out Lieutenant Park Hyunwoo from the communications station, we are receiving a transmission from the Zelonian trade vessel that entered the system yesterday. They are requesting permission to establish a trading post on the planet's surface. Minji nodded and walked over to the communications console. The Zelonians were a peaceful species that had been trading with humans for several years. They looked somewhat like large lizards, but were known for their honesty and fair dealing. However, she had learned to be careful about any alien species that wanted to establish permanent bases near human colonies. Put them through, she ordered. The main screen flickered and the image of Captain Zelkar appeared. He was a typical Zelonian, with green scales and large yellow eyes that seemed to shine with intelligence. He bowed his head respectfully when he saw Minji. "Admiral Lee," he said in careful English, "it is an honor to speak with the famous cake thrower of Harmony Station." Minji smiled at the nickname. Over the years she had been called many things, but cake thrower had become her favorite. It reminded her of how far humanity had come since that day. "Captain Zelkar," she replied, "I understand. You want to establish a trading post on New Busan. What exactly are you proposing?" The Zolonian captain's expression became more serious. "We would like to build a small facility near your main colony. We would provide advanced technology and rare materials in exchange for human agricultural products and manufactured goods. It would be profitable for both our species." This sounded reasonable, but Minji had learned to ask the important questions. "What would be the terms of employment for any humans who work at your facility?" Captain Zelkar hesitated for a moment, and Minji immediately became suspicious. In her experience, hesitation usually meant someone was about to propose something they knew was wrong. "Well," the Zolonian said slowly, "according to our traditional business practices, human workers would need to show proper respect to Zolonian supervisors. This would include certain gestures of submission and deference that are important in our culture." "What kind of gestures?" Minji asked, though she already suspected what the answer would be. "Nothing too difficult," Captain Zelkar said quickly. "Human workers would bow when entering the presence of Zolonian managers. They would not speak unless spoken to. They would accept criticism without argument. These are simply our ways of showing respect." Minji felt the familiar cold anger rising in her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced 5 years ago when Commander Park had thrown cake in her face. The same feeling that had driven her to fight back and change the course of human history. "Captain Zelkar," she said, her voice becoming hard as steel, "let me explain something to you. 5 years ago, humans might have accepted those terms because we needed trade partners and were willing to sacrifice our dignity for economic benefits. But that time is over." She gestured to Lieutenant Park, who immediately began recording the conversation for official records. "Every human colony now operates under what we call the Lee Doctrine," Minji continued. "This doctrine states that any attempt to systematically humiliate, degrade, or abuse human workers will be met with immediate resistance. We will not bow to anyone. We will not be silent when we have something to say. We will not accept criticism that is designed to break our spirits rather than improve our work." Captain Zelkar's yellow eyes widened in surprise. "But Admiral, these are simply our cultural traditions. We mean no offense." "And I mean no offense when I tell you that your cultural traditions are not welcome here," Minji replied firmly. "If you want to trade with New Busan, you will treat human workers with the same respect you would show to members of your own species. You will pay fair wages, provide safe working conditions, and recognize that human dignity is not negotiable." The Zolonian captain was quiet for a long moment, clearly not used to being told that his cultural practices were unacceptable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I will need to consult with my superiors," he said. "This is different from how we usually conduct business." "Then perhaps it is time for you to change how you conduct business," Minji suggested. "The galaxy is full of species who are tired of being pushed around by those who think they are superior. Humans are showing them that there is another way." After the transmission ended, Lieutenant Park turned to face his admiral. "Do you think they will accept our terms?" he asked. Minji looked out at the beautiful new world spinning below them, soon to be home to thousands of free humans who would never have to bow to anyone. "If they do not," she said with a smile, "there are plenty of other species who will."